Hello and welcome to Shattered Lives, Reach Ireland's crime podcast. I'm Paul Healy. I'm crime correspondent with the Irish Daily Star and Irish Mirror, and I'm joined by Michael O'Toole, our crime and defence editor. Hello, Michael.
Paul, hello.
Hello. Well, today we are discussing Graham Dwyer, and some people might roll their eyes and say, Graham Dwyer again. Well, so are we in a way, but he is the story that keeps on giving because he continues to plague the Irish courts, using every means available to him to attempt to get freedom. The desperate actions of someone who has nothing better to do, in a way, but also maybe the arrogance of somebody who genuinely believes that the courts will in some way overturn his conviction for the murder of Elaine O'Hara. So for those people who just aren't overly familiar, although I would imagine most people tuning into this podcast are, obviously Graham Dwyer is serving a life sentence for the murder of Elaine O'Hara, 2015. He was convicted for that in the courts. It was a lengthy trial that graced the front pages of all of the newspapers for months on end. Probably one of the biggest, was probably the biggest murder trial in the country in the last decade anyway. Maybe save for one that we discussed last year, the Jerry Hutch trial, for different reasons, though, very different trials. But Dwyer went to the Court of Appeal and he tried to have his conviction overturned. And there was a high-profile Supreme Court battle and ultimately European Court decision that Dwyer's data effectively had been breached under European law. And so now he is before the Supreme Court and his case was opened as of yesterday. So when we're recording this podcast, yesterday was the day where Graham Dwyer went to the Supreme Court after the Court of Appeal threw out his attempt to have his conviction overturned.
Yes, and there's no definitive date. Sometimes the courts will say we're going to give our verdict or our judgment on the 27th of December or whatever. That's not in this case, so everybody involved will just get the notification of it. But you mentioned two words which are really important in the podcast, Paul, and I'm glad you did. You mentioned Elaine O'Hara, because I was watching the news about Dwyer and I'd been thinking of it myself, and it just struck me that, as ever, victims are often forgotten about. By the very nature, this is about Graham Dwyer appealing it. But this was about a really, in my opinion, a really brutal murder of a vulnerable woman who was groomed for murder for a year. Really, really terribly so, and really, in my opinion, really, really badly treated. And I sometimes people do lose sight, because this is now a legal battle between Graham Dwyer, the man who, in my opinion, rightfully so, was convicted of the murder of Elaine, and the state. But it's about justice for Elaine Dwyer. And I noticed Elaine O'Hara, and I noticed at the hearing yesterday, Elaine's father was there and other family members were there. So sometimes, because of the very nature of our job and whatever, and the tete-a-tete thing, people do lose sight that this is about justice for a woman who was really brutally murdered.
Yeah, and I have to say, I really feel for Elaine's family, her father in particular, who, as you mentioned, was at the hearing at the Supreme Court yesterday. For Frank O'Hara, this is probably a never-ending nightmare, and for many families who've lost their loved ones to murder, unfortunately, they have to come up against a legal system that continues to, in a sense, punish them, because they have to go through the throes of this person who has been convicted in a court of law, appealing in every court in the land their conviction. He's done the Court of Appeal. He lost. He went to the Supreme Court in relation to this data retention issue. It was pushed all the way to the European courts. The European courts found in his favour, which immediately rang alarm bells, I'm sure, for the family. Now it's starting to look like, especially with the Court of Appeal throwing out Dwyer's appeal, that hasn't helped him at all. Look, this is the last hurrah, really, isn't it? In Irish courts anyway, certainly, that we know of, and we'll come back to this later in the pod. Certainly in Ireland anyway, this is Graham Dwyer's last real legal attempt to have his conviction overturned on the basis of this data issue. Now, I think it's a little bit confusing. Even for me, it's a bit confusing. I don't think we need to get into the ins and outs of data retention and the law here, but effectively, the European Court did find in Dwyer's favour that his data should not have been retained by An Garda Síochána, and a key part of the case, or at least from Dwyer's perspective, he argues that a key part of the case against him surrounded the use of mobile phones which were linked to him, and in particular this part of the case that's linked to his mobile phone, his work phone, and he is saying that Gardaí should not have retained that data under European law.
Yes, the guards didn't retain the data. This is the key point. Okay, and it is very complex, and I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. I covered practically every day of that trial, and it was woof. But anyway, so the way it worked up until 2018, when Dwyer won his victory here, phone providers retained the data for 2 years. Okay, and the Gardaí could go. There is a Garda organisation called Security Intelligence, used to be called Crime and Security, and the chief superintendent there had the legal authority to contact Meteor, Vodafone, Air, whatever, and say, under this act, I require the phone data for this phone, for this mobile phone. Okay, so they would say, so it would be like, this phone is attributed to Michael O'Toole. I want the data for that. But here's the real clincher. We know, I have some of them here, we know that there were loads of texts read out during the trial. For example, Dwyer texted about his urge to rape and kill. Okay. That data is not retained. That is not the retained data. All the retained data is that at 10 p.m. on the 9th of January 2024, Paul Healy texted a number attributed to Mick O'Toole, or he rang a number attributed to Mick O'Toole, and they had a 10-minute conversation. You don't hear what is in the conversation, and you don't see the content of the text. That's not kept. It's only that you and I were in contact with each other, and also things like cell site analysis, that you were in Talbot Street. You were near your phone bounced off a mast close to Talbot Street, and that put you in this thing, and the guards can triangulate. And one of the things the guards did in this is they used Dwyer's work phone, which is his phone, as a sort of map, and it mapped him sailing on along the M50 and coming from the west on the day of the murder and that sort of stuff. So it was important information, but I actually agree. I thought it was Mr. Justice Birmingham read out the appeal last year. I thought it was very reasonable. I thought it was very right. I thought that the bulk of the evidence, having sat through it, the bulk of the evidence came from the texts that had been recovered. And as I said, they're not kept. They were recovered from people will remember, the master and slave phones that had been used for this secret relationship between Dwyer and Elaine O'Hara. And after the murder, Dwyer threw them in Vartu Reservoir. And by pure coincidence, a couple of days after Miss O'Hara's body was found in Killicky Mountains, Killicky Wood, in September 2013, they were found in Vartu Reservoir by Garda James O'Donoghue. Fantastic bit of policing, and he got real plaudits for that. But it was those phones that were recovered because they were able to physically recover them and physically recover the texts that were downloaded from the phones, and they provided for me the real smoking gun. Guards had to build up a picture to prove that Dwyer controlled one of those phones, Elaine controlled the other. And they obviously did it, because obviously he was found guilty. But there's a lot of evidence in those texts, in my mind, that pointed to really the inescapable conclusion that Dwyer controlled that phone, the master phone, it was called. And
effectively, that is what Mr. Justice Birmingham did say. I mean, the evidence in relation to that particular data that we're speaking about was minuscule compared to all of the other evidence that you're mentioning against Mr. Dwyer. I just want to read out he described it as limited call data evidence. It was not very significant at all, and it was properly admitted into evidence. Now, the Supreme Court heard yesterday from Dwyer's side that, look, effectively it was admitted into evidence, and you can't just ignore European law. They're saying European law is what it is. The ruling was what it was, in that it shouldn't have been retained. And so they're saying, effectively, it shouldn't have been admitted into evidence, and ignore the rest of the fact of all of the evidence against Graham Dwyer. Nonetheless, evidence was admitted that really they're saying shouldn't have been, and as a result, he did not get a fair trial. There are now 7 judges of the highest court in the land that have, I suppose, an indefinite period of time to weigh up that decision and see whether they agree with Dwyer's side or whether this really is the end of the road for him.
Yes, and you and I aren't experts in this, Paul, but it's our job to speak to people who are experts. So there is someone who I've been in, just let's call them a criminal mind. Okay, so obviously it's a very good criminal barrister who keeps me right, and that person said Dwyer doesn't have a chance. Now they said it about the appeal, so they were vindicated with the appeal to the Court of Appeal. They've said it about this. Now, significantly, they also said they believe effectively this is the end of the road for Dwyer if he loses. We did speak that they can go to the European Court of Human Rights and whatever, but you were telling me off air that Dwyer would have to fund that himself.
Yeah, well, certainly that's what stopped Joe O'Reilly in his tracks. And I remember doing a story about that at the time. That, I mean, Joe O'Reilly, who murdered his wife in Knoll 2004, he did a similar process, went through every court in the land and lost everywhere he could. And then for years, we kept hearing that he was going to mount a case to the European courts. Ultimately, I think he had to foot the bill himself, or wanted to foot the bill himself, or at least that's what he told relatives, and he dropped the whole thing. You could argue maybe he realised he didn't have a case. I think the same might be true probably with Graham Dwyer if he loses this. Is he going to take the effort all the way to Europe? Now, the only difference here is the arrogance of Graham Dwyer is extraordinary, and he also does have, am I right in saying, a considerable amount of wealth? So he might throw as much as he can into it.
I think he was earning, if I'm right, for the murder, he was earning about 70 grand a year, but he lived in Foxrock in South Dublin, and he had a good big detached house. Now, there were other people involved in that house. I'm not going to go into this.
Yeah.
So I don't know. The house has been sold. I don't know about the mortgage, and I don't know how other people in that house, how much they would have got. We don't know, right? But, you know, going to court is prohibitively expensive. So look, all I can tell you is this person has told me they believe this will be the end of the road for Dwyer, and they also believe that he's going to lose.
Yeah, and I suspect they're probably correct. I mean, as I say, that person's an expert, so they know better than you or I. But with the decision from the Court of Appeal, and that was really the only time when anyone was kind of scratching their heads and saying, has he got a chance here? Because of that bombshell ruling from the European Court, there was sort of, I suppose, an expectation in the back of people's mind that maybe he does have a case, at least for a retrial here. But I think the second that Mr. Justice Birmingham threw the case out, and particularly with those damning words that really what Dwyer is arguing about is nothing really, a whole nothing compared to the evidence against him overall. I think that was it. So the Supreme Court, look, I think they will ratify that decision by the Court of Appeal. Anything else would be extraordinary and unprecedented.
You raised something there, Paul, because I think they did want a retrial. Let's play devil's advocate and let's say the Supreme Court does order a retrial, excluding the data records, okay, about Graham Dwyer's work phone. But there's plenty of evidence, as we've said, plenty of evidence in my mind on the master and slave phone. Like, for example, I mean, this is how they identified him. He talked about taking part in flan competitions. He talked, the texter, who the state alleged was Dwyer, talked about taking part in a flan competition and getting a 15% pay cut. Guards were able to prove both those things happened to Dwyer at the same time. He talked about becoming a father, and he named the baby, and that was the same name as Dwyer's newborn baby. There were loads of things, you know, say, for example, even about at one stage, he texted Elaine, said, I want to get you a tattoo done. And they were able to go and check that later on that day, Dwyer went and inquired about getting a tattoo done. So there were dozens of texts that the guards knitted together to, in my mind, give the inescapable conclusion that it was Dwyer who controlled that and was therefore responsible for the murder. Even, you know, other things, physical evidence, you know, that they had CCTV of Dwyer going to Elaine's apartment in Stepside. And there were lots, there were awful lots of things like that. So, I thought the judge was right. The text, for me, the text messages and the life that was unmasked in those text messages was far more convincing than mobile phone data, although the mobile phone data, it was significant. But I wanted to ask you this, Paul, sorry. If just say, playing devil's advocate, the judges in the Supreme Court do order a retrial, excluding the phone data, but keeping the text data and all the other data, do you think Graham Dwyer would be able to get a fair trial?
I think so. Yeah. I think judges are not, and juries are not meant to be swayed by what's said in the media. And I mean, we know this from previous cases that we've covered. I mean, it was said about Jerry Hutchkin, how can he have a fair trial? He did have a fair trial. Yeah, I think he can have a perfectly fair trial. I know we've written everything about him under the sun, and maybe that's going to be a legal argument that he would make if he did have an extraordinary retrial. He might say that he could never have a fair trial, and that will be how he'll ultimately try to walk away from it all.
Paul, I would be amazed, and this is 14 steps down the road, because you and I are of a mind that he's not going to win the Supreme Court thing in Chennai. But I would be amazed, knowing the caliber of people like Remy Farrell, who's the senior counsel, who's the lead senior counsel in this, if they didn't say, look at the publicity that Mr. Dwyer has had. How can he possibly get a jury of 12 people fair and true and all that sort of stuff? So, I'd be amazed if they didn't try that. Just one other point. A couple of names when you were reading the copy from the Supreme Court from RT or whatever, the Irish International. I'm sure a couple of names jumped out at you. Remy Farrell was the senior counsel for Mr. Dwyer, but Michael Bowman was also a senior counsel for him.
Yes, and Michael Bowman most recently represented Joseph Puska.
And who was the prosecuting? There were two prosecuting senior counsel in the case. One was Sean Gearan, right?
And Anne-Marie Lawler.
Yeah. Isn't that wonderful? Just how he...
Well, it shows you the breadth of cases that they deal with. And as we mentioned before in previous pods, they also swap roles. I mean, Michael Bowman has prosecuted and now he's defending. It's an extraordinary job. I kudos to them for doing it. I mean, they have to be impartial. They have to work for their client. I don't know how they do it.
Yeah, the greatest example is Brendan Graham, who defended Jerry Hutch. If I recall, he has... I've covered most of the I would say the majority of the cases I've covered with him would have been him acting as a state prosecutor. And I've said this before. I think it's really remarkable. But it's just so. Just to recap, Elaine O'Hara went missing in the 22nd of August 2012. The belief is she was murdered that day. He brought her up to Killikee and murdered her there and left her there.
And that's when that infamous text message was, "Go to the shore and wait."
And then he dumped the stuff in Vartry, which was his downfall. September 2013, on his birthday, Elaine's remains were recovered, and then Gardaí started their investigation. But the trial, as you say, it was January, I think, started in January 2015. Anne-Marie Lawler was involved in that, but Sean Gearan was the prosecutor. Anne-Marie Lawler was what they call a junior, so a BL. At that stage, she was one of two. But she has now become one of the top senior criminal prosecutors in the country. But and I've always been, that's the first time I really came across, and I've really been intrigued to follow her progress. And it's great to see someone progressing. So she's now a senior, and she was remarkable in the Puska trial. She really was.
They're all top barristers.
They're fantastic barristers, and as I said, it's been really, Anne-Marie Lawler, she was the junior there, and she became a senior shortly after that. And Puska was, I remember. You weren't. I know you did most of it. I was there for the opening, and it was Miss Lawler who did the opening, and she led everything there. This is what the jury is going to hear, and I remember going, "He's banjaxed," because we didn't know this stuff.
And speaking about appeals and the arrogance of these killers, despite the fact that Joseph Puska was so obviously guilty and that incredible opening by Anne-Marie Lawler, it was all obvious from day one. He's now appealing his case. So that's another person, another family that had to go through an appeal process, sadly.
But tell me this, Paul, because you mentioned Joe O'Reilly. I remember I was being with my buddy Shane Phelan, who's legal affairs core for the Indo, but he used to work in the Star and then he went to the Mail. So we were covering the Joe O'Reilly trial in 2007 together. I was doing it for the Star, he was doing it for the Mail. Have you had moments in trials where you go, That's it. He's gone. For me, in the Puska one, it was Anne-Marie Lawler's opening. I can tell you exactly when it was in the Joe O'Reilly case. There'd been legal argument, unsurprisingly, about phone data, because phone data did for Joe O'Reilly. And it was all laid out. So there was legal argument out with the jury. And it was all laid out. It was the first time we'd seen, oh, there's the mask. Ah, he did it. He's goosed, right? And the judge, after legal argument, said, I'm letting the evidence in. And I remember I turned around to Shane and we just said, that's it.
He's done.
So there are moments in trials where you go, it's almost like a big flash of light.
Well, for the Puska trial, there was a lot of legal argument for the Puska trial about what should and shouldn't be admitted. And obviously DNA being the big one. I mean, the second that was admitted in, I went, well, yeah, okay, well, that's, I mean, DNA, game over, you know. For Graham Dwyer, what was it for you? That's a very good point. When there was again legal argument about the mobile phone data. So once I knew that was let in, you started, and I think I probably had it in my mind about how important the mobile phone data had been in O'Reilly, that I thought, all right, that's it. For me, two things. There were videos played of him involved in BDSM, and they were horrific. And then there were letters, fantasies he had written, really bad fiction. I can say this as a fiction writer now. His fiction is shit, right? It's about him, about somebody abducting a lady from a bookstore in Newcastle upon Tyne in England, right? And it was just masochistic shit, right? But I remember that being read out, and I went, this. And there was also a lady, Darcy. Do you remember Darcy Day?
Yes.
Yeah. She, basically she had mental health issues, and there's stuff about him killing her voluntarily or whatever you want to call it. So there wasn't, in the O'Reilly thing, the one big thing was the mobile phone stuff. But with Dwyer, there were so many strands to it. I'd say there were 6 or 7 things, and I went, he is ghost.
But even still, if you recall, I can certainly remember being in a newsroom at the time, Graham Dwyer. I was actually in the Irish Independent at the time, and I there was a feeling that this could go the other way. It wasn't clear to people who weren't in the courtroom anyway. There was a feeling that it wasn't an open and shut case. Now, when you sat there and you saw all the evidence together in tandem, it made sense. But people looking from the outside in, I remember at the time there was sort of a feeling that he could be found not guilty.
Well, you raise a very valid point. And obviously, I knew things that the jury, we were investigating things. I knew things, and I'd known about Graham Dwyer since he was arrested and charged. And I've been doing, I mean, just as an aside, so once he's charged, the shutters come down, right? And it was very frustrating for me because I had a great line. I knew shortly after he was charged that he was mounting his legal challenge to the mobile phone data, because we checked the High Court records
straight away.
And it was there, and we knew it because he did it I think within a week. We just couldn't print it. I was sitting there and I was so frustrated. So I couldn't divorce myself from all the stuff that I knew about Dwyer beforehand. Yeah. But I remember one concern is you never know how a jury can go. So there could have been 2 people on that jury who said, no, there's nothing there, but they came back unanimously. So it's not a concern for me, but I'm saying that would have been a concern for the prosecution and the guards, because nobody knows how a jury, nobody knows the deliberations of the jury. Nobody knows, because you're not allowed to know. So that's a concern. But for me, looking at it, he's toast, but juries are juries. So that was, that could have been different.
He obviously thinks he's so smart, doesn't he? I mean, one thing we do know about Graham Dwyer is that he's continuing to argue to this day that nobody murdered Elaine O'Hara. And I believe those are words that have come out of his own mouth, that he says to people, no one killed her. I mean, that's the arrogance of the man, because he's trying to say, look, they found her body. They believed initially that it was that she may have taken her own life. She was a troubled woman. And that's what he's trying to tell people, that no one murdered her. And that's the arrogance of the man.
And maybe a bit of delusion as well. He would. We know that he's still down in the Midlands, isn't he?
The Midlands, yeah.
Yeah. So, he is certainly, to my mind, extremely deluded. She didn't kill herself. I was only helping her, all that sort of stuff, and I wasn't having an affair, I wasn't having a relationship or whatever. So it's I can't believe it's 9 years since this trial started. It's 12 years, almost 12 years since he murdered her. A long, long time. Because, look, I know that the Hutch trial was massive, but see, at the time, see the Dwyer trial, it convulsed the nation. I mean, it really, really convulsed the nation. It was the first trial. We were the first people to live tweet it. It was Judge Tony Hunt, and I think he led it.
That was the beginning of the live tweets.
that was the beginning of the live tweets. It was, yeah. And I think I put on about 10,000 followers because of it. Because people were just I'm not shooting me. I'm just because people were so obsessed with it.
People were fascinated.
Yeah, it was, and the whole country was gripped by it, especially, just because he was the, he was the, how can you say this? The nice middle class snobby architect, and he thought it was the perfect, all that sort of stuff, and the details of the trial, the BDSA, all that stuff. It was grim. It really was grim, So anyway, look, I don't think my criminal minds person is of the opinion that he's going to lose this, and this will be the end of the road. So let's see if they're vindicated. They've always been right.
Yeah, it could be a very quick decision. Maybe before we even get this pod out, we might know. Although I'd say they'll take their time with it, a number of months. But no doubt we'll be speaking about his latest loss, I'd say, relatively soon. And
the last thing I'll say in this, if he loses, so he's been in prison since 2013. October 2013, really. So, that's more than a decade. He will have at least another decade behind bars.
So does that mean, am I right in saying that he's coming up on his has he been able to go before a parole board yet?
Oh, he's tried, yeah. I mean, we did a story about that because you're thinking because it's 12 years, but when he was eligible for it, it was 7 years.
It was 7.
The 12 years is only brought in recently, and he's been in the system. So, yeah. No, it's a no, basically. But
so he's due. He is actually due his second attempt at parole.
Yeah. So when you think about it, right, so September 2013, the body was found. It was October 2013, the arrest came, because it was about a month, roughly, right? And he was put in custody. And one of the very few people to stay in custody and for murder. And that was because of the bail hearing when all the stuff came out. Which again, we knew, we just couldn't report it to Section 2A. So there was a blanket ban on it. So that was it. So he's been in prison 11 years, almost 11 years. But I think he'll do at least another 11. I have to say, I think, he's regarded as so dangerous that they won't let him out.
Well, he's one of the country's most notorious killers. Yeah, I don't see him getting out anytime soon. The infamy alone, but also you have to admit your crime. You have to show remorse, and he's certainly not doing that. So
yeah. All right, so let's as we keep on saying, it's now up to the judges.
It is. I'll get the cup in again.
There you go.
Okay, thanks for listening to us. We'll see you again.
Thanks, everybody.